So yeah, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming this evening and for being with me here tonight and for sharing this passion for astrology and this curiosity. Yeah, it's a very strange time we're living in. This is the first time I've done a webinar on Zoom. But it's so great because it helps us, me and everybody in sort of my profession to be able to just spread the message and to get it around to as many people as possible. So it's a good thing. Tonight we're going to be talking about life's turning points through astrology. Some of you may have already come to this talk of mine. It's one that I've been holding for a number of years and is probably the most accessible talk to those who don't have any or little experience of astrology. So all you need for this talk tonight is to be able to know your age. And I'm sure you all know that. So yeah, that's the content of my workshop, is basically finding those turning points. I'm sure there's a lot of you that are going to have all these COVID-19 questions. So tonight is not going to be so much about COVID-19. Tonight, we're going to maybe take a little bit of a break from all of that. For the next little while, let's just take a journey, an individual journey into those turning points in life, and to try and just have an open mind to it and an open attitude to it. Have a positive attitude to it. Most human beings are frightened of change or uncomfortable with change. I myself started studying astrology probably because of that reason. How can I control the change? Maybe if I know about it, I can control it better. But it actually had the opposite effect on me, and probably a lot better, to be honest. It helped me realize that I didn't really have much control over change, but I had a lot of control over how I responded to change and how I could prepare for change. So I've named this talk "To Everything There Is a Season." Some of you that might be familiar with Bible verses, no judgment, no neutral like Switzerland here, but it's a beautiful phrase in the Bible about having everything. There's a season to everything, a time for change, a time to sow, a time to reap. And that's essentially what I want to try and convey with my talk tonight, and to try and tune into those cycles and know sort of when the time for something is about to come and when it's about to end. So for those of you who don't know me, Margarita, Mark has given you a little bit about me, but I think I've been interested in astrology for most of my life. And the way that I know that is because I can remember people from when I was a teenager. I remember their names and I remember their star signs. I remember very little else about them, but I can seem to recall people's star signs from about when I was 15, 16 years old. So I think from that stage, I always sort of delved into it, but it was only around my mid-20s that I actually really decided to start taking it seriously. So I run my own consultancy now. I see clients and I teach a 3-month course. I do workshops. I also have an interest in tarot. My dad was a tarot reader, and he passed on the art to me as well. So that is another thing that I do. So I teach both subjects. I'm also a writer, so I write a lot of horoscopes and blogs and things like that. I've contributed to You Magazine and a few publications. I've had a show on Cape Talk and an appearance on Tussen, which is a sort of a talk show program. So I love what I do, and I love to be able to serve. It's so important for me, and I'm so passionate about it, as a lot of you would know. So I thought to open tonight with a few inspirational quotes about astrology that perhaps some of you know and some of you don't. So this is one of my favorite quotes. At the top is, "Be humble, for you are made of earth, and be noble, for you are made of stars." Then we have D.H. Lawrence, who says, "We need not be ashamed of flirting with the zodiac. The zodiac is well worth flirting with." I quite like that one. J.P. Morgan was very famous for saying that millionaires don't use astrology, billionaires do. And that's a fact. In ancient times, some of you might know, kings and queens and royalty and everyone that is really important, even up to presidencies, recent presidencies, used astrologers to plan for wars and plan for marriages and plan for all kinds of big worldly things. And there is a branch of astrology that's financial in nature. And then, of course, the Bible, which I was quoting earlier, "To everything there is a season, a time to every purpose under the heaven, a time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to reap that which is planted, time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up. It's interesting thinking about the time that we are living in now, which is, you know, very important time and a very needed time, a turning point. So the flow of time, you'll be hearing that word out of my mouth quite a lot. Essentially what we astrologers do in a nutshell is we measure time. You know, we look at timelines. We look at the past, we look at the present, and we look at the future. And in many ways, you could think of astrology like weather forecasting, where we measure possibilities, you know, so we look at the evidence and we weigh up how much evidence there is, you know, in a certain direction, and we start sort of being able to make predictions, you know. So usually our rule of thumb is if we see one sign of something, it's a possibility, a small possibility. If we see two signs of something, it's a strong possibility. And if we see three or more signs, we lean towards certainty, but, you know, take that with a pinch of salt. You know, astrologers are fallible, and I like to say astrology isn't. Astrology is perfect. Human beings are not. So, you know, our approaches as human beings, we've always tried to make sense of time and make sense of chaos by using time as markers, you know. Just like I sort of said earlier, you know, it's when are we going to plant and when are we going to harvest? The whole world used to, and it still does. I mean, you know, if you live on a farm and you're involved in food production and things like that, you're still very much subject to the seasons and when you should plant and when you should reap and all those kinds of things. We're quite disconnected from it now. But we still measure our lives by the flow of time, you know, the time that we grow up, the time that we go to school, the time that we fall in love the first time, the time that we start our business, the time we get old, the time we have children, you know, so there's a time for everything. And the sun and the moon has been sort of the main indicators or time hands that we've used. Imagine a world without the sun and the moon to measure time. It would be quite a crazy place. So with the sun, we've used, you know, for seasons and for planting, and we've lived by the sun. We wake up with the sun, we go to sleep as the sun, well, after the sun sets, but you know what I mean. And also the moon. A lot of people plant by the moon. The tides rise and fall according to the moon. The waxing and the waning of the moon is very important for women particularly. So, you know, that is also a marker of time at night. As the sun dictates all of those life cycles and seasons, it follows this formula, you know, so it follows the spring, summer, autumn, and winter, and we can apply that sort of time to everything. We can apply it to the bigger picture of life. We can apply it to our own lives. We can see that in absolutely everything we do, there's a time where something starts, you know, it's fresh, and that's spring, and it's full of possibility and potential. It's just a seed. And then it grows into summer, and then we see the sort of fruits of things that we have sown. And of course, autumn, we begin to slow down, and winter, we completely shut down and we rest. And it looks like death, and it looks like nothing is happening. But winter is absolutely essential in order for spring to happen. So it's a very important experience, and I think I can think of this sort of lockdown as a wintry time in our humanity cycle. So it's a time of gestation and a time of creativity for some people, and I'm sure it feels very difficult because for some people it's hard not to be productive or outwardly productive. It's hard not to sort of live in this very go kind of world. But I think that the most important changes for humanity can happen in this winter time, however long it might last. You know, astrology is absolutely amazing because, you know, since we can track it back to about 5000 BC, when the ancient Sumerians used to carve, paint the sun and the moon on their rock paintings and be able to track the cycles of specifically the moon. You know, so they started seeing that there was this kind of regularity to it. And then soon our eyes went upwards. You know, humanity is always trying to progress. And I love the story about the ancient Babylonians who had these star towers where they would watch the stars. And, you know, over time they began to notice that there were stars that moved in between the other stars. And they called these the wandering stars, which of course were the planets, because the stars stay fixed. And they attributed to them sort of these godlike energies. And they also started noticing over time that, particular arrangements or configurations would correlate to certain events on Earth, and they could kind of apply it repetitively, so it became like this science in a way, where you could start predicting, actually, because you knew that the last 2 times that those 2 planets were together in that particular position, for example, a king was born somewhere. Everyone's familiar with that Bible story. And, there's lots of texts and sort of evidence from many, many hundreds of years ago outlining just that, and outlining this sort of evidence gathering that astrologers did. And we're able to apply, and we are able to apply with quite a high level of confidence, saying, we know that this is going to happen at this particular time. It's been proven over and over again now. So, yeah, I mean, what I've written there, as above, so below. And Natasha says, we are now forced to respect time. It's so true. And I think so much of one of my students, what she said to me as this whole sort of COVID thing started, was, I know, in myself included, the constant phrase coming out of our mouths was, I don't have time. I'm too busy. I wish I had more time. I never have time to cook. I never have time to bake. I never have time to be with my kids. I never have time to watch this webinar. And yeah, like Natasha says, we are forced to respect time and really acknowledge time, like how long are we going to be in this situation? So, it makes sense that the planets can dictate when these cycles can happen to us. I don't like to maybe use the word dictate. So a lot of people sort of assign power to astrology or to the planets, and thereby become quite a victim to these outside events, where it's kind of like astrologers look at planets and their alignments and their predictive sort of nature as a clock. So if you think about a clock is saying that it's 7 o'clock. The clock didn't cause that it was 7 o'clock. It just reflected that it was 7 o'clock. I know that's a lot to think about, but it's not that the planets necessarily cause certain events. They reflect certain events. Okay, so our souls came here with this sort of rough kind of plan, and the planets and the configurations and these life cycles and things that happen to us are simply a way to understand what is happening to us and what might happen to us in that moment or in a future moment. So it's a reflection rather than a cause. So a lot of people, you might be familiar with the meme, Mercury retrograde made me do it, which is quite funny, but it's kind of the wrong language to use, because Mercury retrograde didn't make you do anything. It just reflected a particular space that you were in and a specific action that you decided to undertake, and provided perhaps a bit of an explanation, a bit of understanding around it. So this is my handy chart orientation slide, which hopefully kind of simplifies things a little bit. So everybody gets a chart like this at their birth. So it's very dependent on the time, place, and date of your birth, which is essentially when the chart unfolds. And that is your, let's say, your spiritual blueprints. Yeah, so it's basically your soul map that you get born with. It's very unique to you. It's like a fingerprint. Get a lot of questions about the twin thing. Not going to go too much into that now, but there are lots of fantastic methods and ways that we differentiate between twins and people born at the same time, same place. Also, we have to take into account nature and nurture. It's really important. Someone with a particular chart, same as somebody else's chart, may have had a very different upbringing and manifest the chart in a very different way. So just to quickly troubleshoot that. So this is an example of a chart, and it looks probably quite confusing to a lot of you who are not familiar with this. To those of you who have lots of experience, you know this inside out, and you know how quickly you actually get to learn it. So it's not as complex as it looks once you break it down. Essentially, you can see the signs on the outside. You can see the planets on the inside. There's the moon. That's an easy one to see. And these are all the other planets. So essentially, we use 10 planets in astrology. And I love that, because a lot of people who aren't familiar with astrology will say, well, you can't break up 12, people into 12 signs. And I 100% completely agree. As you can see, your birth chart or your astrological blueprint is so much more than just your sun sign, which is the same as your star sign. It's 1/10 of who you are. It's an important part of who you are, but it is not everything. It's just the part that most people tend to identify with on a very, very conscious level. So you'll see all the planets on the inside here. Like I said, we have 10. We use 5, so what I call very personal planets. They move very fast and we experience them very personally. And then we use 5 impersonal planets, which move a little bit slower, and we tend to experience less personally and more on a generational or a bigger scale. You also see that the chart is divided up into 12. Those are called houses. We're not going to go into that today. And we'll see all these sort of lines and triangles and all kinds of things here. Those are called aspects, and those are the relationships, the mathematical relationships that each planet has to each other. I like to think of the planets as these characters, as you'll see a little bit later on in this talk. I'm quite imaginative, and I like to see them as these sort of actors or archetypal figures. I'm quite strongly drawn to Jung and archetypal work. And that helps me to kind of get an idea of who these planets are. And a lot of people put a lot of emphasis on the signs in astrology. You know, I'm a sun in Libra, or I'm a this or whatever. But actually the most important aspect of a birth chart is the planets, because they are these archetypal beings that symbolize these different parts of us. You know, we're made up of so many different parts. We are very complex. One part of us might be very different from another part. You know, we might be one way in a relationship and another way emotionally, you know, so, or another way at work. So, you know, human beings aren't these sort of perfectly in line, boring creatures. We are profoundly individual, and these planets really reflect that individuality. So these aspects are kind of how the planets sort of communicate, or how these characters communicate with each other, how they help each other or how they harm each other, right? So, and that can show up in their personality or in your life as complexes or difficulties or blocks, as well as gifts and talents. Okay, and we have all of that. This grid here on the side is just a magnified view of the aspects in the middle. Okay, so that's basically how a birth chart looks. There's the person's moon and Mercury and Jupiter and Venus and Sun, Neptune, Uranus, Saturn, Mars, Pluto. These upside down headphones are the nodes. They're not counted as planets. And that's the part of fortune, also not counted as a planet. But okay, so you can all see that. And then just as an aside, we're not going to really use this today, but the ascendant or the rising sign, you might have heard of that before. It's the sign on the eastern horizon at the time, date, and place of your birth. It's very important and treated like a planet, but it's not a planet. Okay, so just to give you a little visual. So our birth charts, a lot of, I think when people approach astrology, they're maybe a little bit afraid of it because they don't want prediction, or they don't want to know what's going to happen in the future. The thing is astrology is inherently predictive in its nature. Why? Because we get this birth chart and we have these configurations in the birth chart. We call it the promise of life. And it says that you're going to have a propensity for being an artist, let's say, and therefore you're going to end up doing things that are artistic, whether it's painting or drawing or dancing or whatever it is. So in a way, your character, who you are in your chart, is your destiny, and in that way it's predictive, right? Now, some people might get a bit irate and say, well, you know, I don't want to be subject to something that's outside of my control. And I think, well, it's a very human thing to say. And we like to feel like we're in control. And once again, really just taking it back to what I said earlier, is that astrology is one of those things that once we start learning it, can help us not necessarily be in control of what happens, but be in control of our responses and reactions to it. So a lot of you will often hear me talk about the example of the addict or alcoholic. And this might be shown in the charts. You know, there is a particular configuration for it, which has a high possibility of leading that person into situations where they're going to dabble in alcohol, drugs, or whatever it is, or any other kind of addictive behavior. However, there's a point at which you become conscious of that behavior and you choose to do differently. So, you can have a drink set in front of you and you can say no, knowing that this is a part of your chart and your life and who you are. And it's something that you're going to have to deal with the rest of your life, but you don't have to become a victim to it. So astrology kind of empowers you to start making different choices in the face of certain challenges, rather than feeling like tossed around and like you just don't have any choice. So your birth chart is that snapshot in time. A lot of people ask me, especially my first-time students, can I change my birth chart? Does it ever change? Of course we evolve, and there are certain techniques that we can look at to see where you are evolving towards. However, your birth chart is kind of like, that's your soul, personality, character, whatever you want to call it. It's the thing that you came into this life with. You're not going to get rid of it that easily. Paramhansa Yogananda, who wrote Autobiography of a Yogi, has a whole discussion on this in his book, in that book, where if you get to a certain level of enlightenment by doing lots of meditation and going to the Himalayas and becoming a yogi and a guru and all those kinds of wonderful things, that you do transcend the birth charts. And I do believe that does happen. So that's also something to keep in mind. So here we have this birth chart as your potential of who you are. Now, you might have the birth chart, and this is a very extreme example. I've never seen this. I don't know how this looks. But let's say you've got the birth chart of a murderer or the next president, okay? The thing is, all of this potential needs to be triggered. It needs to unfold, that's the term we often use with astrology. And how does this potential get triggered? It gets triggered by the transiting or traveling planets that travel around the birth chart. So when you're born, it's like someone's taken a photo of the heavens and they say, okay, that's your birth chart. But the planets don't stop moving. Of course they don't. They're constantly moving. So they move round and round the birth chart. They carry on moving round and round the birth chart, and they make certain aspects, and they wake certain planets up at certain particular points of your life. And I'll show you a little bit a diagram of how this looks. So why do we want to know any of this? Isn't it easier to be ignorant? Yes, arguably. I do sometimes think to myself, wouldn't it have been so much nicer not to know all of this? But, it's a tool for consciousness. And I think that if we are aware of just life cycles that are coming up, even if we don't know our birth charts and we don't know our astrology, you don't have to know your astrology for tonight, we can start preparing ourselves. We can start doing all the things that we need to do. And when we move into it, it's not such a shock. It's not so like what the hell's going on. At least we have some forewarning. We've watched the weather forecast. We know it's going to rain. We took an umbrella. Okay. There we go. That like point number 2. It can help us get through difficult periods. So I see a lot in my consultations, people coming to me and asking most of the time, when is this going to end? And I promise you, with this COVID-19, I think I've had that question about 100 times, maybe more. And it just helps you sort of get through the tough periods and know that things aren't forever and that they are cyclical. Everything changes. The only constant thing is change. So going to an astrologist, studying a course, doing a workshop can help us to understand and pinpoint where exactly these changes are going to happen, which is not something we're going to be able to do in our group today. But it is very useful learning a little bit of astrology or going to an astrologist so that you can be more aware of where this is going to happen, not just the kind of energy that's going to unfold. And if we will be able to adapt, or if it will be a little bit more of a struggle for us. Okay, so then we can make those preparations, save money, don't buy that car, whatever it is that we need to do. And I'll tell you, most people go ahead and do their thing anyway. It's very rare that I actually, share a birth chart and some guidance and advice that people don't always listen. We are human. We just kind of go in and believe that fate will somehow change or things will change. So yeah, that does often happen. So when I talk about life cycles, I spoke about those 10 planets that we use. I only use 5 of the planets. Why? Because they are slower moving in their orbits, and hence the changes are more long lasting. They hang around for a long time. If we had to use, for example, the moon in a life cycle, the moon changes signs every 2.5 days and moves into a different area of our charts every 2.5 days. Imagine watching that moon every 2.5 days, you'll go crazy. So the same goes for the sun, the moon, the sun, Venus, and Mercury. It changes every month, you know. So again, that's just a little bit too much micromanaging. So we only use these 5. Jupiter spends a year in a sign. Saturn spends 2.5 years in a sign. Uranus spends 7 years in a sign. Neptune 14 years, and Pluto around 30 years. It depends. He's got an irregular orbit. Okay. So just to give you a little visual, I'm very proud of this visual. I did it yesterday because usually I do this in front of people and I can draw it. So, or I can just kind of demonstrate it. So this is just an example of the Saturn cycle, which we're going to go into very shortly. So here's your birth chart, right? And there's your birth chart Saturn, the Saturn that you were born with, the placements, the sign, the house. It's static. It doesn't move, right? When you're born, that Saturn continues to travel around and around your birth charts, okay? And as Saturn moves around your birth charts, he makes aspects to your birth Saturn, okay? We have the Saturn square, so he makes a square aspect. Then it's a 7-8 year cycle, so every 7 or 8 years, he makes that square aspect, then he makes an opposition, so he's opposite your birth chart Saturn. Then he makes another square aspect to your birth chart Saturn, and then he comes all around to make a conjunction, or what's known as the Saturn return. So we're going to explore that a little bit, but not quite yet. But just to give you an idea of what's actually going on there. Look, if you are new to astrology, this is going to be a lot. And I'm very happy to send you this diagram afterwards. So you are born with Saturn in a particular position in your chart. Let's say in the sign of Pisces, in your first house. You don't need to worry about that, but it's frozen in time. Yeah, so the inner planet is the birth position of Saturn. So everybody has Saturn in a particular place in their chart when they're born. And it's a different place for everybody, okay? So in this diagram, there's your birth Saturn. It's frozen. It's inside your chart. It doesn't move, okay? But from that moment you take your first breath, that Saturn is frozen for you, and that's your chart. However, Saturn in real time still continues to move in the sky, okay? And as that Saturn moves in real time in the sky, he makes these particular aspects to your birth chart Saturn. So he says hi, it's like, okay, he wakes it up, he triggers it. And as he travels around every 7 or 8 years, transiting or traveling Saturn makes an aspect to your birth Saturn, okay? So he goes round and round and round your birth chart for the rest of your life, pretty much. And he makes these sort of visits, or he triggers your birth chart Saturn, and certain events start to happen. So perhaps it will start making a little bit more sense when I go into a few examples. Okay, I hope that's mostly explained. Alrighty, so here's a little picture of Saturn. Now, this is a very friendly picture of Saturn. I don't know if there's some of you out there who might not have a great or think that Saturn has a really bad reputation. You're not wrong. You know, he is, in traditional astrology, he's called the Great Malefic. You know, malefic, maleficent, not so nice. The thing is with Saturn is if you work with Saturn, I like to call him the tough love teacher. He can be very, very rewarding. But for many people, Saturn is difficult because his archetypal energy is the old man, father time, lord of death. He's the last planet that you can see with the naked eye when you look at the sky. So he rules boundaries. He rules that point between life and death. He rules the material world. He rules decay and the underworld and things. Well, not the underworld so much. That's more Pluto. But he rules that kind of material, heavy, dense stuff. And the qualities that he presides over on the difficult side can be fear and restriction, negativity, even depression. It can be rigidness. It can be harsh. It can be gloomy. It can be overly structured. It can be authoritarian, okay? So I like to usually start with the sort of more difficult qualities. When we work with Saturn on a more positive level, he transforms into wisdom. He transforms into commitments. He's authenticity. He learns boundaries. He's wise. He's responsible. He's authoritative or can take a position of authority. He's able to do the hard work. He's able to be structured, you know. So Saturn has definitely a positive side as well as a challenging side, and is, in terms of predictive work and life cycles, is probably the most reliable planet in terms of that predictive work, because, yeah, as you'll see, most people really do tend to resonate with Saturn. So he wise old man, father time, the karmic reaper. That's also really important. Saturn traditionally rules karma. So what you sow is what you reap, and the position and the sign of Saturn in your charts personally can tell you a lot about your karma, and the lessons that you came with in this life, and the difficulties that you're going to have, and how it gets easier over time. Usually Saturn is quite difficult pre-30, and then, you know, over 30 we tend to bloom into that energy that Saturn's given us. Okay, so he's got it's actually 7 3/4 year cycles, so it's a 7-8 year cycle. I'm sure you've all heard about the 7-year itch, and perhaps you want to think back in your own lives about times where a certain relationship got to that point, 7-8 years, a certain job got to that point, 7-8 years, whatever the situation, that seems to be the turning point. And perhaps some of you know this already, but your skin generates, you basically have a whole new body every 7 or 8 years, brand new cells. So it's really interesting. So these 7-8 year cycles, they're all about hard work, lessons, duty, responsibility, fears, insecurities, change, karma, time, and eventual wisdom. And then you can see by the gift of Saturn, we have wisdom, maturity. That's a really important one, actually. It's the grow up planets. Authenticity, long-lasting rewards if we do the work, emotional and physical stability, and acceptance. Okay, so I'm sure at this point you're like, okay, well, what does that mean for me? So here's where it gets kind of interesting. So if we break down Saturn cycles into particular ages, and perhaps you can think about yourself, someone you know, a child, a parent, a friend, a boss, a colleague. You know, life cycles is not just for ourselves, but it brings so much understanding to the people around us. So prior to 7 years, there's a lot of things that go around about, like, children's brains kind of almost solidify in a way at 7 years old, and it's much harder to learn new languages and things like that. There's almost no structure before 7 years old. And most of us tend to go into a structured school system around that time, which is the first initiation of Saturn. It's the first Saturn life cycle. And if we go back a slide or two, that will be sort of when we are born. And then when Saturn gets here and makes an aspect to your birth Saturn, you're, 7.5 years old. So he's making his first square aspect to your birth Saturn. Okay, and he's triggering that Saturn in your birth chart. So we go to school, which is a very Saturnian thing. It's got rules and regulations. It's got uniforms here in South Africa and a lot of other countries. Even if it doesn't have uniforms, there are particular structures that you have to follow. We go to big school, we have to listen to those rules, and we encounter our first experience of teacher. And Saturn is well known as a teacher archetype. Now, those of you who might know your Saturn, you can just kind of think to yourselves, well, do I have a sort of Saturn in a good sign, in a positive house? You know, school is cool for me. I love going to school. I couldn't wait to put my bag on and go to school and do all the rules and follow all those structures. But for those of you who might have a more problematic Saturn, it may have been a bit more difficult to deal with that structure and to deal with those boundaries, and maybe, even have some authority issues. So it can be quite insightful to think about, well, how do I respond in my life to these kinds of things? So 14 years, so we spent those first 7-8 years in school, and it's great. I don't know about you guys, but it took a lot of learning to get to, in my time, it's still standard 5. For some of you, it's grade 8. But by the time you get to that point, you're like, okay, cool. I know the rules, like I know what I'm doing. And then, but more change. You go to high school, and then the whole ball game changes again. So that's another Saturn cycle. So here in this diagram, bum, 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 another 7-8 years, and you're 14, 15 years old, and you've got a Saturn, traveling Saturn, opposing or making an opposition to your birth chart Saturn. Now, the way that most people experience that at that particular age is rebelling against authority, rebelling against teachers, rebelling against parents, the Saturn figure. Follow my rules and you're under my roof and you'll do all the things that I tell you to do. So we experience that as coming at us, like this opposition. And we have to learn how to challenge authority in a healthy way. And we have to build a sense of security. If we don't, we can experience things like acting out, rebelliousness, drug use, dropping out of school, all those kinds of things. And that can also be indicated perhaps if you have a more challenged Saturn or a more easier Saturn. So, that is a very, very important time. Our bodies change, everything kind of changes again. Then we get to 22, 23. And if we look at the diagram, we're traveling along, there goes Saturn after 14, 15. And then you get to 22, 23 years old, and he's making another square to your birth chart Saturn. So at this point, a lot of us are feeling very adulty. We have to move out. We've probably finished college or university. We're eating beans on toast. We might have our first very serious relationship, even get married and have kids. I know for those of us who are especially older, that was kind of done around that time in that generation. We take responsibility and we start our careers. It's very, very serious and it feels heavy. It feels like the Saturn responsibility is on our shoulders. And I think a few years down the line, you realize, well, no, that wasn't quite adulting yet. It's getting a lot more, it's still going to get a lot more serious. But it's still a very important time where we have to adjust to new rules, new responsibilities, our coming of age and things like that. So this is my favorites, the Saturn return. So the Saturn return, if we go back to this diagram, is essentially when that traveling Saturn goes all the way back to the same place he was when you were born. So he returns, essentially. Now, remember what I said about Saturn being this karmic planet? It's kind of when you have this reckoning. For those of you who have been through your Saturn return, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. There's this kind of like, oh my gosh, I'm 28, 29 years old. My life needs to change. I'm not living my authentic life. I signed up to this life when I was 22, 23, and it's actually not what I really want. I'm a lawyer, but actually all I want to be is a veterinarian or whatever it is. So it's a very interesting time. And I'm reluctant to say it's good or it's bad because I'm an optimist, and I believe that it always has a good, positive outcome. Even though if there's some of you that are maybe in it at the moment, and I feel you, I've been there, it feels like, oh, my life is over. It can feel very depressing and heavy. And for some of you, this might feel like, oh my gosh, this is the best thing that's ever happened to me. I can't wait to change my life around. Again, this kind of really boils down to the condition of Saturn in your own charts. We don't have time to do that tonight, but if you study astrology or go to an astrologer, they'll kind of point it out to you. But yeah, Manel, it is challenging. It is this real adulting. It is this kind of taking stock of your life. It feels like an initiation, and it's not just marriage and kids and career changes. It boils down to traveling. It boils down to illness. It can have like parents change. It can be starting your own business. It can be realigning your goals. It can be realizing that you're a creative or a healer, so it's very different for everybody, again, depending on how your Saturn is in your charts. And it really sets the tone for your 30s. A lot of people, the advice that I give is just let go. The more you resist the change, the more you're going to suffer, really, because the thing is with Saturn is I've seen a very, very clear formula. It has 3 stages. The first stage is feeling stuck, like feeling like you're stuck, but you're not quite sure where it is that you need to go yet, but you feel frustrated and you start feeling down. And then eventually it gets to a crisis point where you can't take it anymore. And either something happens to you from the external or you initiate something that change happens. And that stage, the middle stage, is usually quite intense because it's adjusting to the change. And it's a bit like shell shock, because it's like your life has gone upside down. And then there's the integration stage where it's kind of like the dust is settling. You're still kind of like not sure what's going on, but there's a new feeling to life, and perhaps you've stripped a lot of things bare. So we have 2 Saturn returns in our lives. If we're lucky, 3. So we have the first one at 28-29, the second one at 58-59. So 3 Saturn returns in your life. The first one, which is usually like cold water over your head. The second one, 58-59, usually a lot easier if you dealt with your first Saturn return and made the important changes that you needed to make. Then the third Saturn return is much later. I actually have a good story about this. There was once I forget the names of the deities that were involved, but I think it was some kind of acolytes that went up to Lord Shiva. Yeah, that could probably be it, Katja. Who went up to Lord Shiva and he said, look, Shiva, I don't want to go through my Saturn return. Like, sorry, I'm opting out. I've heard that it's really, crazy. And Shiva said, well, look, sorry, but no one gets a, out of jail free card. And this acolyte walked away and disappeared for his 2-3 years and came back to Lord Shiva. And he said, guess what, Lord Shiva? And Shiva was like, what? And he said, I avoided my Saturn return. And she was like, how did you do that? I locked myself in a dark box for 3 years. And Lord Shiva said, well, you had your Saturn return. So there's no escaping or avoiding it. And my advice is to embrace it because it is the greatest time of change that you'll ever have in your life. And any one of these cycles, and really is prompting you to step into your most true, authentic self. So it's a positive. Okay, embrace it. Right, then we have our next Saturn cycle, usually at this point from 30 onwards. So we don't have as much issues post 30 as we do pre 30. We tend to be able to handle those Saturn lessons with a lot more sort of adulting and maturity. So our next Saturn cycle is around 36, 37 years old, and usually can be quite a successful time, and because it coincides with the Jupiter return, which we'll talk about. Okay, so onwards, we can always kind of measure that by your 7-8 years as you go. So quick Saturn return life changes. J.K. Rowling was born in 65. Philosopher's Stone came out in 1997 when she was 32. She wrote the whole thing when she was in her Saturn return. So she was in her dark box, essentially. And she completed the series in 2007 at her midlife crisis. At his first Saturn return, Winston Churchill became a liberal in Parliament, an event which had huge lasting repercussions on his life. Beethoven, which is a really interesting one, knew he was going deaf, so he released his first symphony at his Saturn return. Adolf Hitler returned to Munich and joined the National Socialist German Workers' Party. 2 years later, after his Saturn return, he was elected part chairman or Führer. Very big turning point as well. Luciano Pavarotti made his debut. His second Saturn return, he separated from his wife of 35 years. Eckhart Tolle is my favorite one. You guys probably know who he is. He had a whole conversion experience. He sat down on this bench when he was 29 and he just watched all these people go by and he completely changed his life. He had a conversion experience and began his life as a spiritual teacher. Florence Nightingale at 30 left for the Crimean War, totally unheard of. And Princess Diana at 31 at the tail end of her Saturn return separated from Charles. So she also went through quite a tumultuous time during her Saturn return. Okay, so on a lighter note, the Jupiter cycle is kind of the opposite of Saturn. Jupiter is abundance and fortune and growth, and he's your lucky charm. Yeah, so he has 12-year cycles where he travels around the charts. And every 12 years, he comes to the same place as your birth chart's Jupiter, which is called a Jupiter return. Same as the Saturn return, but way nicer. So around 12, 24, 36, 48, 60, 72. Now, give or take a year or two, because sometimes it can happen a bit earlier or a little bit later. So those periods of life, we also might experience change, but they tend to be the kind of change where we're quite optimistic. Even if a relationship ends, or a career ends, or a new career begins, we tend to feel like this is expansive. Okay, so just also thinking about that, his words are expansion, wealth, fortune, luck, growth, abundance, and the easier lessons. So he's our guru and bringer of growth and good fortune. Okay, just as a little side note. So now for those of you who are talking about your mid-30s, so Just as a caveat, for those of you who are feeling these important things in your mid-30s, now, life cycles is not the only thing that can happen in your life to create change, okay? It is just the most sort of generalized. If you are experiencing a change in your mid-30s or outside of these time frames, that doesn't mean anything unusual. It actually just means that you might be experiencing another kind of astrological configuration at that time in your life, which is quite big, okay? So we can have big life changes outside of life cycles. Important to remember. In order to understand that, again, visit an astrologer or learn some astrology if you really want to understand when, how, when did it start, when is it going to end, and why did it happen. So we have the midlife crisis, and I don't want to scare everyone because we do have COVID-19 and we've got enough to worry about. Again, just try and see this as a positive opportunity for growth and change, okay? And also just some affirmation and validation for what you might be going through. There is like this grand plan that's going on behind the scenes. So usually happens between 36 and 44, but more than likely 39-ish, 38, 39, and 44. But sometimes as early as 36, even 35, because we have the Saturn cycle. So around this time, a lot of people find it a total wild ride. They absolutely love it. I see a lot of people starting businesses around this time, or even having their first children, which is happening a lot to women these days, where they enter this astrological midlife crisis. And I use these little things as the thing for the crisis, not, it's not like a drama, it's just change, it's life change. So we can have our first children. For some people, their children grow up and leave home. It coincides with the start of peri or premenopause with women, and most recently discovered male menopause. It's a thing. So around 42-ish for men. Yeah, Uranus. So often new relationships. Sometimes we get married for the very first time. I've seen that happen a lot. Sometimes we get divorced. Sometimes we have a massive, huge business success, and sometimes we have a huge failure. Sometimes we sell all our stuff and we move to India. So these are the kind of things that we can expect. And sometimes they're a bit smaller. We just go through a big spiritual transformation. Okay, I'm going to explain a little bit about why that happens. We have 3 planets there are 4 chapters to the midlife crisis, but 3 main chapters. So around sort of between 36 and 39, Pluto makes an aspect to your birth Pluto. And Pluto is this archetype of the underworld, of Hades, the destroyer, the lord of transformation. He's all about control and letting go and surrender. So, around that time, we can feel the sense of destruction coming to certain areas of our lives, but also transformation. And we may experience this pattern of realizing this is where I've always given away my power, and now I need to take my power back. And situations can appear in your life where it empowers you to do that. So we rebuild. It transforms and helps to teach you to let go, not hold on so tightly, learn lessons through obsessions and letting go of obsessions. Sometimes I feel with the Pluto part, it can be subtle. Sometimes people don't even feel it, but some people might feel it very strongly. Some people might feel like there's certain parts of themselves that are dying. And that's very good because there's a whole rebirth thing going on. And we have to learn to empower ourselves, acknowledge and own our dark side. Okay, some of us might get into very powerful positions at this time of our life as well. So his gifts are letting go of control, transformation in whichever area of life he is in terms of your chart. Maybe he's in your relationship area and you meet someone and it's totally transformational and it changes your life and you go and live on an island, So that's a very extreme. You can see I like drama, but that's the kind of picture you can get. Or it says, okay, that you need to empower yourself by leaving this person and it's better for you. That's if Pluto's in your relationship area, for example. Might be in your career or your money area, whichever. And so you empower yourself in that particular area of life that he's indicated in your chart. Okay. So once Pluto is done and you're feeling like, okay, I've empowered myself, I feel kind of like in control of things, Uranus comes along and his archetype is the sky god. He's kind of lord of lightning. He's electrifying. I often see Uranus as like this rebellious motorcycle god, going off on his own. He was discovered around the French Revolution. So this is why he has these qualities of individualism and authenticity and freedom and individuality. Pluto, you know, just to go back to Pluto, he was discovered during the wars, which is why he has this whole destruction transformation thing going on and dying and rebirth. So Uranus is the bringer of chaos and disorder and shocking awakening. And wherever he is in your charts, he's going to get triggered around the ages of 39, 42, most commonly around 42. And he's like, okay, wake up. You need to free yourself. You need to express yourself authentically. You need to claim your individuality. You need to claim your freedom. Where have you gotten stuck? Where have you lost your individuality? Now's the time to break free. It can be quite extreme, you know, that's when you see people buying motorbikes. That's why I call him the motorbike god, and going off and all of that kind of thing. Or people just kind of selling all their stuff or doing something kind of shocking. That's Uranus, you know. Sometimes it can be a surprise pregnancy. Sometimes it can be meeting someone you've been single your entire life, and now, out of the blue, you get married and you settle down. You know, so it's always quite shocking, and it sets you free. I love the Uranus cycle. I think it's very exciting. There is another Uranus cycle around 21 as well, where this kind of energy takes place. So we act rebelliously with abandon. We need to define ourselves and become someone more different and more fully unique and authentic. We can go against authority. We can act in very shocking ways that no one expects. And we can suddenly have these urges to break free. Okay. The thing is with Uranus, we have to try and be a little bit temperate, because we can throw the baby out with the bathwater. You know, Uranus is not, what's the word, considerate. So we can be very abandoned, and sometimes we might think, oh, maybe I acted too quickly. Okay, but the more kind of trapped you feel, the sort of more you'll tend to act out. So his gift is giving you freedom in the area of life where he is living in your chart. So if he's in your career area, for example, your Uranus midlife crisis transits around 42 might suddenly have you like, oh, you know what, I'm starting my business and I'm starting a cupcake shop. And that's what I want to do because I've always wanted to bake. You know, so that's if Uranus was, for example, in your career area, but it can be in any other area of your chart. Okay, authenticity, individualism, and independence. Again, he's one of my favorites. And then one of the last chapters is Neptune, as many of you know. What is Pluto and Uranus time cycle in years on the birth chart? So Natasha, Uranus is in a sign for 7 years, and Pluto is in a sign for around 30 years. Okay, so Neptune is the water god, or Poseidon, and he was discovered around the time of film, you know, those spiritualists where they had those turbans on and they read their crystal balls and they called the seances and they did all that kind of thing. That was the time that Neptune was discovered. So spiritualism is assigned to Neptune. Film and photography, so creativity, illusion. And also, interestingly enough, Neptune was around at the time of when drugs were freely available. So he rules things like addiction as well. But on a higher level, Neptune is unconditional love, compassion, divinity, spirituality. Can be very beautiful. Like I said, every planet has a dark and a light side. So very spiritual. He can be smoke and mirrors. So around 42, you might experience this Neptune energy like a need to escape. You know, that's Neptune. It wants to escape from reality. You might feel a sort of spiritual yearning as well, and actually might adopt a completely new spiritual path. It can indicate a time where there's a bit of deception or illusion in your life, so you can feel a bit confused and you're not sure what's real and what's not. And I've often described it as driving through a fog, you know, not having your lights bright enough. So the thing is with Neptune, you have to trust and you have to let go of control and you have to surrender and you have to trust that there is some kind of divine plan and go where your intuition takes you. This is not a forcing time. A spiritual rebirth, we have to be careful of getting stuck in the victim, martyr, tyrant triangle. I'm a victim, everything always happens to me, or I need to sacrifice myself for the greater good. It can be tricky with Neptune. And we need to be careful of what our decisions are with Neptune, because we might think, I don't know, doing that thing that's slightly, not above board is a good idea, but then it's not so much of a good idea. So this is a time where spirituality really needs to be a big theme in our lives, and trust and intuition, because the gifts of Neptune lead to spiritual awakening, connection, direction, wisdom, and clarity. Okay, so midlife crisis, life changes, all these were really positive. Stan Lee, who's now passed away, created his very first hit comic. He was the Marvel guy, just shy of his 39th birthday in 61. Vera Wang, for all the fashionistas out there, she only became a fashionista at 40, which is incredible. I thought Samuel L. Jackson was famous forever, but he only really got famous at 43. Steve Carell from The 40-Year-Old Virgin got that movie when he was 40. Ang Lee, first big movie at 38. And Martha Stewart only really became Martha Stewart in her 40s. So again, really positive things that can happen with our midlife crisis.